Welcome to the audiobook edition of Shiokari Pass by Miura Ayako, a timeless classic that has touched the hearts of readers worldwide. This poignant and evocative novel transports us to Japan at the turn of the 19th century during the Meiji period, a time when Western culture and ideas began to challenge Japan's traditional values. Miura Ayako paints a vivid picture of the social and spiritual struggles faced by her characters, immersing us in their journey through this transformative era. This is a Chronicles of Luke production dedicated to bringing you stories that resonate deeply and inspire reflection. Copyright is held by their respective owners. No copyright infringement intended. Miura Ayako, an esteemed Japanese author, masterfully intertwines themes of love, sacrifice, and faith in this narrative, which is inspired by real events. The story centers around Nobuo Nagano, a young man whose life is marked by both personal and societal upheaval. As Nobuo navigates the trials and tribulations of his journey, we are invited to reflect on the profound moral and existential questions that define the human experience. Shiokari Pass is not just a tale of individual struggle, but also a tribute to the enduring human spirit and the power of selfless love. As you listen, you will be drawn into a world where every emotion is felt deeply and every decision carries significant weight. Prepare to be moved by this beautifully written story and to explore the depths of the human soul in Shiokari Pass. We hope you enjoy this audiobook and that it leaves a lasting impression on your heart and mind. So find a comfortable place, relax, and let's dive into the story of Shiokari Pass. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Forward. Ayako Miura is a well-known author in Japan. Her books and serial stories captivate an increasingly appreciative public. No wonder there is in her writing a sensitivity, a texture which to the Western reader is characteristically Japanese. That quality we recognize in their art, their flower arrangements, their dress, in fact, their scenery, for they are the product of their beautiful environment. Ayako Miura's heart is in her pen. Reading of Nobuo Nagano and Fujiko, you wonder how much is autobiographical. Much is, she admits, but the story is a revealing picture of Japan and the Japanese, valuable to those of us who cannot go there and see for ourselves. Now that it has been filmed, we shall be able all the better to see what we can already imagine so vividly from her writing. Shiokari Pass, however, is Ayako Miura's own creation, based on the true story of a certain M. Nagano, who more than 60 years after his untimely death is still revered in Asahikawa, Hokkaido, where he was a high-ranking railway employee. He was an unpretentious person, choosing to live simply and to dress even shabbily in order to support his mother and to give his earnings to people in need and to deserving causes. Awarded a princely imperial grant for his services to the state during the Russo-Japanese War, he gave it all to found a young railwaymen's Christian association. Nagano was, in fact, a highly respected public servant, renowned for his integrity and popular with his men. He worked late in his office day after day to lighten the load on his staff, and this did not go unnoticed. Problem personnel tended to be sent to him because of his ability to handle them and win their confidence. Intractably lazy and troublesome characters began to work well when he was stationed in Sapporo. He took pity on a compulsive alcoholic who had been given up as hopeless by his own family and sacked by the railway board. Aggressive when drunk and beyond caring for himself, this man was unwelcome in anybody's house. Yet Masa Nagano shared his home with him, enduring many indignities until, after many months, he was fully cured and rehabilitated. Then Nagano prevailed upon the board to re-employ him. Masa Nagano was a brave man too. A missionary in Hokkaido came under suspicion of being a wartime spy and suffered a great deal of hostility. Disregarding the repercussions upon himself, Nagano wrote to the newspapers and tackled the security authorities on the foreigner's behalf. A quiet and peaceful person by nature, he was nevertheless a powerful and even a fiery public speaker, and he was a fearless Christian in a currently intolerant Buddhist Shinto society. In his ceaseless efforts to share his faith with his employees throughout the wide area under his control, he traveled widely, visiting railway men's Christian association groups. It was on the way back from an outlying station one freezing day that the incident occurred, which inspired the writing of Ayako Miura's book. As a result of what happened, many of his employees and townspeople became Christians. The information about Masa Nagano came from the records of the Asahikawa church and an old man who remembered him and had become a Christian through his influence. Mrs. Miura points out that Nobuo Nagano is not the same person as Masa Nagano, although she has used the same common surname. Nobuo and Fujiko are her own creations. This book, in the original Japanese, has done much to remove prejudice and to introduce Christianity to her own people. The publishers are indebted to Mrs. Miura and her translators, Bill and Sheila Fernhow, and to Worldwide Films for the opportunity to make this book available to all who enjoy the film and read the story, and for their generous cooperation. Chapter 1, The Looking Glass. There's no getting away from it. You're just like your mother, not only in looks but in character as well. Nobuo Nagano's grandmother, Tose, was in a bad mood whenever she spoke like this. Nobuo knew that when she said he resembled his mother, who, according to Tose, had died 2 hours after his birth, she was far from flattering him. He had been born in Hongo, a high-class suburb of Tokyo, in 1876. The 10th year of the reign of the Emperor Meiji. I wonder what sort of person my mother was, he thought as he knelt in front of the mirror, peering closely at his face. The round, well-shaped eyes, the straight nose, the firm, well-defined mouth. My mother must have been quite good-looking. 10-year-old Nobuo didn't notice his own mischievous expression as he raised his thick eyebrows. Why is it such a terrible thing to take after my mother, I wonder? But he could not hope to understand what was going on in his grandmother's mind. He pulled down the corners of his mouth and wondered if his mother's face had ever looked like that. Shutting one eye, he raised his eyebrows and glared fiercely into the glass. The effect was rather frightening. His lips pursed into a wry smile. Perhaps my mother used to smile like that, he thought. He tried another smile. This time he opened his mouth wide and studied his teeth, gleaming white and with not a single bad one among them. He gazed intently at his uvula hanging down the back of his mouth. I wonder what that's for, he thought. As he imagined his mother with a funny thing like that too, Nobuo was struck by a strange new emotion. As a rule, he did not think much about his mother, but now he was suddenly overcome with the tenderest of feelings towards her. As he put his finger in his mouth and tried to touch his uvula, he felt himself on the verge of tears. Before he could stop them, they were spilling down his cheeks. Nobuo, why are you crying? His grandmother Tosa's voice came from behind him. She was a heavily built woman, and when she got angry, she was far more frightening than Masayuki, his father. Nevertheless, generally speaking, she made a fuss of Nobuo, and he didn't dislike her. Only he hated the way she became bad-tempered whenever the subject of his mother came up. I put my fingers in my throat and made myself cry. His reply was true enough, but she sensed that in fact there was another reason for his tears. Stop playing the fool. Only the common people let themselves be seen crying. We are of samurai stock, so you mustn't do such a thing. As she said this, she knelt down close to Nobuo. He had never seen his grandmother kneeling, except in a meticulously correct way, with her knees together and her feet tucked neatly underneath her. So he supposed that all women sat as she did. However, only a few days before he had found that this was not so. There was a fellow called Roku, a hawker, who was always in and out of Nobuo's home. Roku sold combs, tasseled ties for men's kimonos, cuff protectors, thread, scissors, and so on, in a set of lacquered boxes, which he carried slung over his shoulders in an enormous cloth patterned with arabesques. Your ladyship was what Roku called Tose. Roku had moved to Tokyo from Niigata only 2 or 3 years before. Tose had been born there too, so she and Roku always had plenty to talk about. He would hang about the kitchen for hours discussing such things as Western fashions, as though he were a complete authority on the subject. Nobuo always looked forward to Roku's visits. Not that he liked Roku particularly, but he sometimes brought his boy Torao with him. Torao means tiger. Torao was only 8, 2 years younger than Nobuo, but because there were so few boys of his own age and class in Hongo, Nobuo enjoyed Torao's visits immensely. On one occasion, Roku took him to play at Torao's home. Stepping across the rickety plank over the gutter and entering the doorway, Nobuo was astonished to find that it opened straight into the living room. But all the more astonishing was the sight of a woman of about 30, with her breasts exposed, kneeling at a table with her legs stretched out to one side. I didn't know that anyone behaved so badly, thought Nobuo in disgust. Now, as his grandmother knelt beside him, with her feet tucked properly out of sight, Nobuo found himself thinking again of Torao's mother. On no account must you let people see you crying, repeated Tosa. No, he nodded. Then, putting his hand on Tosa's knee, he said, Grandmother, open your mouth and let me look inside. What do you mean, open my mouth? Do you know you've got a thing like this at the back of your throat? Nobuo opened his mouth wide and showed her what he meant. It's a disgrace for a woman to open her mouth like that. There was nothing further to be said on the subject. Masayuki Nagano, Nobuo's father, was an amiable man. One could hardly imagine that he had been raised in such a straight-laced environment. He held a position in the Bank of Japan and had the refined bearing of someone brought up in court circles. Leaving his son in the care of the unrelenting Tos, he hardly ever interfered with his upbringing. Thus Nobuo thought of his father neither as a particularly awesome person, nor as a particularly kindly one. But then something happened. He was severely reprimanded by his father for the first time in his life. It was a warm Sunday towards the end of March, and Roku and Torao were visiting the Nagano household. Nobuo and Torao were lying on their stomachs, sunbathing on the outhouse roof about 8 feet from the ground. Torao's name, Tiger, did not suit him. He was a lovable child with large round eyes like 2 black beans. From the house next door, the sound of an organ wafted faintly, the tune of the children's song, Butterfly, Butterfly. Nobuo strained his ears to listen. Somehow he fancied that the person playing the organ was Miss Yoko Nomoto, his teacher, whom he adored. She had a fair complexion and soft almond eyes. Nobuo thought that, with her russet coat fastened at the throat and her sprightly step, she was altogether a different kind of being from other women in the neighborhood. Every year Miss Nomoto taught the beginner's class. In his first year at school, Nobuo had been in her care. She often used to stroke her pupils' heads. Even the most mischievous little monkeys became self-consciously well-behaved when she did that. She had a lovely scent, too, quite unlike the oil his grandmother used to keep her hair in place. When he held her hand, he felt as if it was somehow melting into his own. Once, in his first year at school, he had suddenly become anxious, fearing that Miss Nomoto had left to get married. Maybe when I go to school tomorrow she won't be there anymore, he thought. I know what I'll do. I'll marry her, then she'll never go away. This struck him as a marvelous idea. The next day when the bell rang for break and the children all streamed out to the playground, Nobuo hung around the classroom. What's the matter, Nagano? Aren't you going out to play? Nobuo nodded without saying anything. The teacher went over to him, surprised. Is your tummy sore or something? There was that lovely smell again. Nobuo shook his head. Well, you ought to go out and get some exercise. Teacher, Nobuo faltered. What is it? Miss Nomoto peered into his face. When I get big, I'm going to marry you. So don't go away, will you? Nobuo spoke boldly now, without stopping for breath. Having got the words out at last, he did not feel the least bit embarrassed. Marry me. Miss Nomoto was overcome with surprise. At last she spoke. I understand. Then, with a solemn face, she gave a brief tug to straighten the shoulder of his kimono. Promise you'll wait for me and not go away? As if to reassure him, she grasped Nobuo's hand and gave him a knowing smile. Nobuo was overjoyed. Now she'll not go away, thought Nobuo, and ran noisily down the corridor to play outside, his face wreathed in smiles. Now he was in the 3rd grade and had forgotten that he had ever said such a thing to Miss Nomoto, though he liked her as much as ever. Whenever he met her in the corridor, he bowed to her even more politely than he would to the headmaster. Meeting her in the corridor really made his day for him. Your teacher is lovely, isn't she? Torao. Torao was in the 1st grade. Uh-huh, but my mother chases me with a ruler. Torao was more afraid of her than of his teacher. Does your grandmother ever hit you with a ruler, Nobuo? No, she never hits me. The organ music stopped. Hey, Nobuo, do you know what is at the other end of the sky? Seen from the roof, the sky looked different. Dunno, said Nobuo flatly. What Do you mean to say you're in the 3rd grade and you don't know what's at the other end of the sky? Torao's round eyes sparkled with merriment. How should I know? I've never been there. Nobuo raised his eyebrows crossly. I know, and I haven't never been. Torao lapsed into his backstreet way of speaking. Okay, what is there then? There's the sun. What? Don't be stupid, Torao. The sun is in the sky. That's not true. It's at the other end of the sky. Torao stuck to his guns. The place where the stars and the sun are is in the sky, Nobuo repeated firmly. That's a lie. When you draw a picture, the sky is on top of the roof, isn't it? This is the sky. Torao waved his hands about in the air above the roof, where he was crawling. That's the sky over there. Nobuo wasn't giving in. That's a lie. That's the other side of the sky. The two of them forgot where they were. They stood up on the roof looking daggers at each other. I tell you it's a lie. Torao gave Nobuo a push. Nobuo lost his balance and slid down the roof. Both of them screamed as Nobuo tumbled over the edge and fell to the ground. But he was lucky. That day, Tosei had taken off the mattress covers and laid out all the old wadding to air in the sun. Nobuo landed on top of the wadding. He expected to fall on his head, but only his ankle was hurt. I'm sorry, Nobuo. Torao came scrambling down from the roof, almost in tears. You didn't make me fall off the roof, understand? Nobuo grimaced with pain as he rubbed his ankle. What? Torao could not see what Nobuo meant. Don't you tell anybody that you pushed me off the roof. Nobuo spoke rapidly in a commanding tone. Torao gazed humbly at him. Roku had heard the yells and was the first to arrive on the scene. What happened, Sonny? His face was ashen as he glared at Torao standing helplessly. It's nothing. I was playing on the outhouse roof and fell off. The roof, Roku exclaimed. Then turning suddenly on Torao, he gave him a savage swipe. Torao, it was you, wasn't it? Torao began to wail. What has happened? It was Grandmother Tos. I'm terribly sorry, madam. This Torao here, Roku began to explain, but before he could say any more, Nobuo broke in. That's wrong. I fell off the roof myself. At Nobuo's words, Roku pulled a face. Sonny, what's more important is whether he's hurt himself or not. Tos was unruffled. She examined the color of Nobuo's face and said to Roku, There doesn't seem to be very much wrong, but take him to the doctor just to make sure. Almost falling over himself with haste, Roku heaved Nobuo onto his back and carried him to the nearest doctor. He had sprained his ankle, but there were no bones broken. All the same, when he got back and lay on his bed for a while, Nobuo felt tired out. It's a good thing it wasn't more serious, said Tos as Masayuki came into the room. She stood up and stepped aside for him, and then went off to the kitchen. Seeing Masayuki, Roku bowed his forehead down to the floor in confusion. I'm terribly sorry. Torao has done a terrible thing. Torao hung his head dejectedly. I keep telling you, it wasn't Torao, Nobuo said irritably. What happened exactly? Said Masayuki mildly. As a matter of fact, this urchin of mine pushed... I see. He pushed Nobuo off the roof? Yes. The perspiration was streaming down Roku's nose. No, he didn't. I fell off by myself, shouted Nobuo excitedly. Masayuki smiled knowingly and nodded 2 or 3 times. He was overjoyed to think that Nobuo had it in him to try to protect a boy younger than himself. Oh, so you fell off by yourself, did you? Of course. Do you think I'd let a slum kid push me off the roof? When he heard this, Masayuki's expression immediately changed. Nobuo, will you repeat what you have just said? Roku flashed a glance at Masayuki's face, and Nobuo blinked at the cold tone in his father's voice. He spoke stubbornly and unfalteringly. I said, do you think I'd let a slum? Before he could finish the sentence, Masayuki's hand landed a heavy blow on his cheek. Nobuo could not understand what he had done to make his father so angry. His grandmother had always reminded him, we Naganos belong to the aristocracy. We are different from the common people. So how could he admit, even if forced, that a commoner's boy had pushed him off the roof? Nobuo scowled at his father. Why didn't he praise me instead? He wondered. Torao, I want you to let me see your hand. Masayuki smiled understandingly at Torao. Sheepishly, he held out his dirty little hand. Nobuo, how many fingers does Torao have? 5. His cheek still stung. Right, then how many fingers does Nobuo have? 6, I suppose. Nobuo bit his lip. Nobuo, what is the difference between a boy from the aristocracy and an ordinary boy? See if you can tell me. He's right, what is the difference anyway? Nobuo thought. Looking at it this way, he could see no difference. But grandmother always said they were different. Yet there's a difference somewhere, he could not help but think. There is no difference. Both have 2 eyes, both have 2 ears. Right, Nobuo? Professor Yukichi Fukuzawa said, heaven makes neither one man above nor one man below another. Do you understand, Nobuo? Nobuo had heard of Professor Fukuzawa many times. Right, people are all the same. The common people are not necessarily baser than the aristocracy. On the contrary, if for some reason either should commit a murder or do something like that, the aristocrat would be more responsible and guilty. He spoke harshly. Nobuo had never thought that his father could be so severe. But most of all, the words, the aristocrat would be the more responsible, struck him. Nobuo had grown up to believe that aristocrats were undeniably superior beings. As obvious a fact as that snow was white, fire was hot. Can it really be true that all people are the same? Biting his lip fiercely, Nobuo buried his head in the pillow. Nobuo apologized to Torao and Roku, commanded Masayuki gravely. Nobuo could not yet bring himself to make an apology. Doesn't Nobuo know how to apologize? Don't you know what an awful thing you have said? Without waiting any longer, Masayuki placed his hands together on the tatami matting with grave formality and bowed his head deeply before the trembling Roku and Torao. He remained in this position for what seemed an eternity. The sight of his father in this attitude was unforgettably engraved on Nobuo's mind.